What's up, everybody? This is Spare Speaks. This is my first podcast episode, and today we have Ariel Gonzalez and Benjamin Cook, and we are going to discuss radical Islam and the effects in the Middle East it has, and our foreign policy, and all that good stuff. Okay, so the first question I want to ask is, I guess I'm gonna just use the debate between Reza Aslan and Sam Harris. Are you guys both familiar with those two people?
Yes, yeah.
Oh, definitely. Yeah.
That's pretty much the way I imagine this going down, and I'm more of a Reza Aslan type of guy than a Sam Harris. But let's just talk about, is Islam an inherently violent religion? Can we blame a significant part of the violence, suicide bombing, and stuff on the fact that Islam is written a certain way? So either one of you who want to start that, go ahead.
Did you want me to start, Ben, or because I can?
Yeah. I'll defer to you on most of the
All right.
ancient theology stuff. Sure.
Right. So, like any other, what I would call a world religion, Islam. See, here's the problem with most of the dialogue. It's either that Islam is either inherently violent, Islam viewed as a monolithic entity, or Islam is a monolithically peaceful religion. And I think that's a very, very black and white way to look at it. The way that most people that study Islam look at it is by looking at certain sects or certain historical periods in Islam and asking yourself whether or not these are the most legitimate streams of Islam when compared to the entire tradition. So if someone were to ask me if Islam is inherently violent, I would respond by saying that Islam, qua Islam, or Islam insofar as it's Islam, isn't violent per se, because there's many different sects in Islam. So, for instance, there's the Ahmadiyya sect, which is a very, very it's a minority sect in Islam, and it's not violent. It's actually a pacifistic sect within Islam, and it's actually currently being persecuted by the Shia and the Sunni terrorist groups. But if you were to ask me for instance, if we look at Sunni Islam, and if you ask me if the most authentic, well-respected traditions in Sunni Islam encourage violence, then I would have to say yes. If you look at Islam's most trusted sources and Islam's most earliest traditions. So if you look at, for instance, the Wahhabi movement that draws from the Salafi tradition, and Salafi is another way of saying the first generation of Muslims. So the whole point of the Salafi movement is that the Salafis want to look at the first generation of Muhammad's followers. There are some sources within Islamic tradition that say that the most trusted authorities within the Muslim community is to be found within the first generation after Muhammad's death. And if you look at those earliest sources, then we find certain traditions and certain narrations which are very sympathetic to what we now call jihadism or Islamism within groups like ISIS and Boko Haram and other militant groups.
So would you say that type of encouragement to violence doesn't exist in any other religion?
It certainly does. So, for instance, if you were to look at Christianity historically, so within the medieval period, there were certain movements. So certain movements within the Crusades, certain movements within the persecution of the Waldensian heretics, certain anti-Semitic, persecution movements. There have been streams of Christian militancy, but those aren't found within the most authentic, trusted sources of Christian, theology.
Yeah, and if I can chime in real quick,
Go for it.
And I think this is a point that both Ariel and I would both want to emphasize is I think usually when we're talking about the quote-unquote most authentic theology or tradition, we're usually talking about the actual scriptural sources in the New Testament and the Quran and the Hadith, respectively. And so I think we both would argue that when you look at the broad theology and teachings and narrative of the New Testament, it's either radically pacifist or it supports some sort of very limited just war theory. Whereas I think when you look at many passages of the Quran and the Hadith, they kind of overtly encourage violence and conquest. But again, Ariel can expand on the particulars of that.
Okay, let me just say, Ariel, we can hear you like sliding something around and typing and stuff like that.
Oh, sorry. Let me try to move my computer away from the phone then.
Okay, it's no big deal.
Yeah, no problem. So what were you looking to? What did you want to ask me in particular? Are you trying to ask me what sources in particular teach Islamic militancy, or?
I guess we don't need to go down that route. Ben was what I think was saying that there's a higher degree of what I guess we can call an incitement to violence inside the Quran than there are in the other biblical texts.
Right.
Well,
so
yeah. Just really quick, I was just going to say, we do have to, I think, make a sharp distinction between the texts in the Old Testament and the New. There are definitely overt incitements to violence and a lot of actually very ISIS-like stuff, and actually that's no accident, because the early Islamic Sharia tradition, which ISIS and other radical groups draw from, they explicitly draw from many of the punishments that are in, for example, Leviticus in the Old Testament, and etc., because they view themselves as part of that tradition. But within Christianity, all the New Testament teachings that are more pacifistic, that Jesus says he's come to fulfill the law, so those old ritualistic laws, and especially the more brutal laws, don't apply anymore now that God has had his fullest revelation. So yeah, that distinction between the theology of the Old Testament and how the New abrogates it, I guess, or fulfills it, or does away with it, or however you want to characterize it, is really important.
And Islam has never had that kind of abrogation before, right? There's never there was no Reformation period in Islam to kind of put that Old Testament type stuff in the back seat. Is that right?
Nothing analogous, to my knowledge. I mean, Ariel could probably speak more in detail to that.
Right. So actually, what would really be instructive would be to explain some of the context behind the Quran and to compare it to the context of the Bible, and to explain how it can't be the case that the Bible is inherently more violent than the Quran if we just look at them as books. And let's just, for instance, let's disregard the tradition for now, because there's a lot of other authoritative theological sources for some of the teachings in Islam. But just taking the Quran as just one book and comparing it to the Bible, let me just spell out some of the differences between what the Bible teaches about violence and what the Quran teaches about violence.
Cool.
Right. So a lot of the issues I have with the way people characterize the Bible vis-a-vis the Quran is that they fail to take into consideration the fact that the Quran is literally about 14% the size of the Bible. So the Quran is a very, very, very small book in comparison to the Bible. And the Bible itself isn't actually a single narration. It's traditionally considered to be 66 different documents, 73 in the Roman Catholic Communion, but traditionally 66 books written over a period of over 2,000 years by over 100 different authors in different time periods. And not even all the books are of different genres, and not all of them are directly quotations of God himself. So if you look at for instance the book of Isaiah, for instance, is mostly quotations from God, either from the mouth of God or from the mouth of Isaiah. But if you were to look at, for instance, First Chronicles, most of it is historical narrative. So quoting something from First Chronicles isn't going to tell you exactly about what God approves or disapproves of. It depends on the context and how you interpret the passage. And there are canonical rules of interpretation behind those passages. Now, the Quran, by contrast, is completely from God's mouth. That's what the tradition is. The tradition is that God literally spoke those words through the angel Gabriel to Muhammad, and Muhammad memorized those words. That's what the Quran literally means in Arabic. Quran means recitation. So it's God literally teaching Muhammad through certain narratives, but mostly through exposition, certain commands.
That would mean that there's almost no room for reinterpreting the text. There's no room for a peaceful-minded person who reads the Quran to not interpret it in a way that is directing towards violence. Is that what the conclusion of that is, or the implication of that is?
Well, some Muslims certainly do interpret or reinterpret some of the verses in the Quran in a peaceful manner. So, for instance, there are some texts that speak of violence against unbelievers, but given the very character of the Quran, and this is something else I should also mention, the Quran is notoriously ambiguous. So, and it's very ironic because the Quran was written over 600 years after the New Testament, and yet we have so much less historical context for the Quran than we do of the New Testament. So, if you were to read the Quran from beginning to end, without the aid of any biographies of Muhammad, or without the aid of any of the context of 7th century Arabia, for example, you would know little to nothing about what actually happens in the Quran, or what God talks about. So if you talk to the average Muslim who reads the Quran, you won't know much about the Quran from what he or she teaches you from the Quran. So you have not only that complication, you have the complication that that it's God speaking, and that there's no historical context at all.
Right.
Interesting.
And to chime in again really quick to go off what Ariel is saying, and I'm sure he was going to bring this up eventually, but another important distinction in Quranic interpretation is the distinction between the Medinan period and the Meccan period. So Muhammad's community obviously began as a kind of, and again, Ariel, correct me if any of this is wrong, but Muhammad's community began in Mecca as a kind of minority community, of course. During that period, most scholars, I think, agree that the more pacifistic and religiously plural and tolerant verses of the Quran were penned or vocalized, whatever, by Muhammad during that period. Eventually, Muhammad and his followers were kicked out of Mecca. They formed the earliest truly quote-unquote Islamic community in Medina. So they grew, they got more powerful, and eventually they attacked and basically took over Medina, destroyed idols there, and etc. So now this was the point at which Muhammad's early community becomes a kind of dominant religio-political force. And again, my understanding is that most scholars think that what are called the quote-unquote sword verses, the ones that explicitly advocate violent conquest, killing polytheists and other unbelievers, and brutal punishments and these sorts of things arose during that later period. And in early Sharia or Islamic law interpretation, there was a very early tradition in the Islamic community that developed an interpretational tradition that basically said that those later verses abrogate or supersede the sword verses, the later ones, abrogate the earlier, more pacifistic ones. And again, I believe that's because the later ones somehow represent a more mature understanding or the most recent progress in divine revelation later in Muhammad's life.
So I guess a common criticism I've heard is like, what about I guess whenever attacks are done by Hezbollah and ISIS and the Mujahideen, it's always justified as religious violence. So what about like things that are done? Well, I guess it's not. I guess I will agree. I guess I could admit I don't think there's any room for disagreement about the inherent aspects of violence that's in the Quran. But let's bring that to what's happening now. And Ben, do you think that if America never had a presence in the Middle East, or Israel never had a presence in the Middle East, that there would still be some kind of violence at the level we see now?
Probably not. But I don't think admitting that is to simultaneously admit that there isn't a problem with violence inherent in, especially modern Islamist ideology. But yeah, I mean, my general position on this issue, and again, I know a lot more about the modern Islamist political movements than the more ancient history, is basically that the religious and the political components of modern Islamist ideologies, again, whether we're talking about the Muslim Brotherhood or Hamas or Hezbollah or the Taliban, the religious and the political elements are, I think, always symbiotic. I don't think that you can divorce them, and so basically, the only thing that I want to emphasize, and I try to emphasize with my more leftist or more libertarian friends on this issue, is not that American foreign policy and authoritarian regimes and our complicity in those regimes doesn't serve an ampliative role in terms of how it in terms of forming radical extremist terrorist groups. But it is an ampliative role, right? It's making something, in the sense that it's making something more intense that's already there, right? There's already there are already a set of religious ideas that are floating around, and they're intrinsic, not only to these communities, but they're intrinsic to the way in which these groups talk about the problem of, say, European colonialism and American foreign policies. These groups never talk about it in purely secular terms, right? So I think a lot of people have this kind of idea that, well, these are basically just extremist, reactionary, anti-imperialists or anti-colonialists, right? But if you look at what they actually say, it's really interesting. So you see this in like some of the earliest Islamist, modern Islamist thinking, like the Egyptian school from Cairo, people like Rashid Rida and Al-Afghani and so forth, where they basically say that the reason that Allah has allowed the West to politically dominate many majority Muslim countries is actually, in their view, it's because the Muslims in those countries have strayed from the true or purest path of Islam, right? So even in their condemnation of Western imperialism or colonialism, they still turn it back on themselves as a kind of religious issue, right? That God has allowed this as a sort of judgment on the Muslim world for them failing to live up to the purest Islamic ideals. And not only that, but again, if we're going to characterize them as kind of essentially anti-imperialist or anti-colonialist, we always have to ask ourselves a question: if this group, whatever particular group we're talking about, if this group were in power, right, what would they do? What would they want, right? And we're not in the dark about this, right? I mean, these groups release statements all the time. You have charters like Hezbollah and Hamas and Al Qaeda release many statements. ISIS is doing the same now, and they all explicitly have advocated a theocratic, totalitarian Sharia form of government that is supposed to replace what they view as these oppressive Western governments. So I guess, again, the main thing I'm trying to get across is that these people are not against oppression or authoritarianism or imperialism qua those things, or simply in virtue of being imperialism or authoritarianism. They're against those things because they're un-Islamic authoritarianisms or un-Islamic imperialisms, because they all endorse their own, again, theocratic, totalitarian, expansionist political ideology that they would replace their local secular dictatorships with, or Western influence with.
Well said. Well said. Ariel, you have anything to say on that topic?
I don't know much about modern Islamism, but in terms of the sources for those beliefs, they do find their root within the early caliphate. So if you do look at the early Islamic State, so for instance, look at the caliphate of Umar, there's sort of a lot of parallels between the totalitarian nature of, for instance, the modern Islamic State and the early caliphate. There is, for instance, the suppression of religious speech. So, for instance, Christians weren't allowed to build churches under Omar's caliphate. There's the dimitude of the Christians and Jews, where they had to pay a special tax for their protection of religious identity. There's a lot of similarities, and that's that's the main issue.
Well, wasn't the Ottoman Empire a very liberal Muslim empire? Although it was an empire, it was.
Yeah, well, what you consider liberal is always kind of relative to the historical context.
Fair
obviously.
enough. Fair enough.
Right. But in certain ways, yes, and there are certain ways in which the earliest Islamic caliphates were more liberal, say, than the Byzantine Empire. They allowed for more religious pluralism and so forth.
You all right over there, Ariel?
What's happening?
If you're gonna do stuff like that, you can just press mute on the phone.
Oh, did you hear that? What did you hear?
It sounded like you were falling down or something like that.
He was getting too excited.
All this talk makes me want to jump.
Oh, I'm sorry, I was talking to somebody else, and I was trying to be quiet. But
okay, no problem.
But yeah,
but yeah, what I was going to say though is, again, so there, and actually most of the reading I've done in this area has been from authors who come from a more leftist perspective, and they obviously tend to, I think, try to whitewash early Islamic history or overemphasize the kind of more amenable aspects, right? That oh well, they let Christians and Jews lived. They were so religiously pluralist and etc., while ignoring other very significant facts, like Ariel is pointing out, like a lot of religious oppression, having to pay a special religious tax, right, if you're not a Muslim under the early caliphate, and many other things. I mean, they did not have equal rights with Muslims, right? And of course, we do need to look at things in the historical context, right? That, like, again, in many ways, they were more of a liberal empire than like the Byzantine or the Persian empires were. But we have to keep in mind that Islam is making a unique claim about the life of Muhammad and about, especially, what they call the first four rightly guided caliphs, which is that though these are divinely sanctioned examples of how human beings and how society should be run, right? And so, for someone who subscribes to broadly orthodox Islam, they don't really have as much wiggle room to say, well, yeah, they were liberal for the time, but now we kind of know better, because you can't really claim that you know better, right, than how the first four rightly guided caliphs ran society, or how Muhammad himself ran society, because they're supposed to represent the final revelation of God and how political and social life should exist.
But doesn't that isn't the most authentic view of Christian? Like, I what I'm getting is, I could be wrong, is that the Bible is a little bit more up to interpretation, but the Islamic tradition is not. I mean, I know there's, obviously I'm more familiar with Christianity than I am with Islam, but the different sects of Christianity, isn't like Catholicism meant to be a fundamentalist type reading, a literal reading of the Bible?
Well, again, and Ariel, I'm sure, can chime in on this as well, but I'll just start off by just saying, like Ariel was saying before, when you have a collection of 66 plus books, I mean, they all have different literary, historical genres, right? And so there's no one way to read the entire Bible, right? So no one's going to read, Song of Songs or, the Psalms in a literal way, right? Those are books of poetry. Most Jewish and Christian commentators have thought that the book of Job is an allegory. The early passages of Genesis are an allegory. And so you have to look at each book and each section and try to see what is the literary genre of this or that section, right? And again, Ariel can probably say more about that.
Wait, so was the question why there's so many Christian denominations as compared to Islamic denominations?
Yeah, it was basically saying that I was getting the impression that Islam is inherently supposed to be interpreted at a fundamentalist level, as a literal level, but why is there a distinction between Christians not having to do that and Islamists having to do that, to accept that strict interpretation? But like Ben was saying,
well, there are certain things that to be an Orthodox Christian, you do have to literally believe, right? So, the central doctrine obviously is the death and resurrection of Jesus. So you do have to believe that Jesus actually existed. He actually performed miracles. He was God incarnate, and he atoned for the sins of humanity through dying and rising from the dead, right? Those are non-negotiable things. So there are certain things you do have to take literally, but I think what's important, though, is not which parts do you have to take literally, because both Muslims and Christians do, to be Orthodox, they have to take certain things literally. The question is whether the most violent verses in the scriptures, whether you have good reason to think that those apply literally to the current communities, respectively, of Christians and Muslims. And I think what both Ariel and I are trying to argue is that in the case of Christians, all of the violent passages, incitements to violence, are part of the Old Testament, and the Orthodox view in Christianity is that those rules don't apply anymore. Those commands don't apply anymore, right? Now the community is supposed to be basically pacifistic and defined by faith, hope, and love. Islam has a lot harder time trying to do that because again they don't have their own kind of New Testament, right? Muhammad and his life are the final revelation of God, and he himself, especially in his later years, advocated violence and conquest.
So what that brings me to is, well, okay, let me ask you this first. Do you both think, or would you argue that America is a Christian nation, or would you argue that we're a secular nation?
I would argue that the U.S. is a de facto secular nation, but you could argue that in principle, the founding fathers had a Judeo-Christian identity, even though they weren't themselves uniformly Christian.
Right.
But they held the part of the Western canon is the Bible, and they held that in high esteem. So I would call it a de jure Christian nation.
You agree with that, Ben?
Yes and no. I mean, broadly, yes, I do. I mean, from what I have read, it seems like most of the founders and the framers were either some sort of Protestant, usually a more kind of what many mainstream Christians now would consider a kind of weird heretical sect of Protestant, or they were deists. I mean, these were men of the Enlightenment. It seems like most of their thinking was the more deistic view of natural religion, while also holding. And this is paradigmatically Thomas Jefferson. Tore all of the the supernatural verses right out of the New Testament. He has his Jefferson's Bible, right, which is basically this no miracles allowed deistic Enlightenment Bible. And I think some of the founders were more Jeffersonian, more deistic and like that, and others were more just kind of typically Protestant or Quaker or other things like that. So I don't think the United States is uniformly any particular thing, but if what Ariel is trying to say is that the founders and many of the early state constitutions and our own constitution, were they Judeo-Christian in the broad sense of like a Western belief in a providential God, and that traditionally that's more associated with Jewish and Christian traditions? Yes, but I don't think it's helpful to call us a Christian nation. We're not in any substantive or relevant sense.
We're not a theocracy in any sense.
Right, and as Middle Eastern countries like maybe Iran, Syria, Pakistan would be considered theologies or theocracies.
Yes, and I think that actually might be a good segue into another aspect of this whole discussion, which is I think we have, especially with the rise of international terrorist groups like Al Qaeda and ISIS, or more local ones like Hamas and etc., where they're more like minority groups engaging in extreme violence against local states or around the globe. I think it tends, in the public discussion, I feel like that tends to shift focus away from the very glaring fact, right, that there are major states in the Middle East, especially, that are the embodiment, right, of not what a terrorist group would look like, but what radical Islam looks like embodied in a modern authoritarian state. So we don't have to imagine even, right, what these states would be like. We saw what the Taliban was like. Thankfully they don't have total control over Afghanistan anymore. But again, the two biggest examples are obviously Saudi Arabia and Iran, right? These are two explicitly theocratic, authoritarian, and totalitarian regimes, right, that are constantly engaged in countless human rights abuses, sentencing, journalists to 1,000 lashes. People are still stoned to death in Saudi Arabia. They can still be sentenced for it in Iran, although it's becoming more rare. And again, poets and artists and et cetera are routinely arrested and also, again, sentenced to lashings and et cetera. And so I think we have to keep in mind, because again, this is, I think, another thing that kind of gives the lie, right, to the narrative that, well, radicalism, this ideology, is always this kind of reaction to extreme oppression from the West or from local dictators. Well, it's not, because we see the state, the official state level embodiment of radical Islamist ideology in the United States right before us, and it's gone on for years and years, and we see what the results are. We see what the actual application of this radical religious, explicitly religious ideology is, for how it actually runs a major modern state. Radical Shia ideology in Iran and Wahhabist Sunni ideology in Saudi Arabia, respectively.
You see, the interesting part for me on that subject is why is Saudi Arabia our greatest ally in that area? It's things like that make me question the intentions of American foreign policy. Like Sam Harris was saying, he made the perfect weapon argument, which is imagine what Gaddafi or Assad or Osama bin Laden or Saddam Hussein would do if they have a perfect weapon that can just kill anybody at any time with no casualties. What would they do? And then imagine Obama. What would he do if he had the perfect weapon? Would he just pick out the bad guys and that's significant when it comes to the morality of what's going on.
Sure.
But,
yeah.
I have trouble accepting that, and I don't like to say it, but I have trouble accepting that as fact when we are allied with one of the most extreme examples of Muslim extremism. And we're doing that, and we're going into other countries that may have not been that extremist, like Afghanistan. And although we did have the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, I think that pretty much spawned from the invasion of Russia and our aiding and training and supplying the Mujahideen in the first place.
Well, let's focus on that in particular really quick, because I think the Soviet invasion and the CIA's involvement in arming the Mujahideen during that, and et cetera, that's often a topic that's brought up, right, in these discussions, especially between libertarians and conservatives. And it's definitely true, obviously, that we overtly, explicitly supported the Mujahideen in their fight to eject the Soviet Union and their occupation from Afghanistan. But the story is not as simple as, well, we armed the Mujahideen, they became the Taliban, and the Taliban obviously is one of the most repressive, right, Salafist Islamist groups, and they harbored Al-Qaeda, etc. So we kind of did it to ourselves, right? That's kind of how the story goes. And again, there's a kernel of truth in that, but I think something that's not mentioned enough, and that is vital to that story, that usually doesn't get said, especially on the left and among some libertarians, is that Saudi Arabia, again, which is a theocracy. Sorry, I'm trying to find my words here. It's a Wahhabist theocracy explicitly, right? And Wahhabism is one of the more extreme Salafist, right, modern Islamist movements. It started in the 1700s. But Saudi Arabia has they were essential in funding the early Taliban, and in particular the madrasas or religious schools on the border of Pakistan and Afghanistan, where most of the Taliban came in and started kind of taking over after the Soviet Union was ejected. So Saudi, yes, we had our part to play, but I don't think it was so obvious. I don't think it should have been completely obvious to the United States at the time, right, that any particular sequence of events was going to happen. I mean, modern radical Islamist movements hadn't taken the form that they have now. It would have been very difficult to predict. I mean, we had the Soviet Union and Soviet expansionism on our plate, and so I think it wasn't a crazy or unreasonable assumption that we should do whatever we can to try to push back Soviet influence in the region. So I want to say that, and I also, again, want to emphasize that Saudi Arabia was the one that really funded the Taliban directly, well, both directly, but also through the madrasas in Pakistan, where most of the Taliban came from, and basically exporting their radical Wahhabist ideology into that chaotic situation.
Fair enough. But you see, like, even that confuses me as to why we're even allied with Saudi Arabia in the first place. You know, if we can come to that conclusion, it's still a confusing situation. I guess we could argue that there's significant economic, geopolitical reasons for that alliance, but it just creates a sense of distrust, for the libertarian side of this argument. Yeah. I guess if you're going to argue that America is wrong in the Middle East, it can't be. It has to be based on the fact that whatever the mainstream story is, it's not totally not. It's not that it's wrong or it's false, but it's just covering up other intentions that we may have. That's just the feeling. But let me just ask you. So you would say that under a just worth type of theory, that it was justified to use the Mujahideen to fight against the Soviet invasion or the Soviet presence in Afghanistan. Would you go that far, or would you just?
Well, I have some thoughts on that, but I kind of want to hear from Ariel, because I don't know too much what his thoughts on foreign policy are, so I kind of want to hear what his thoughts are.
Yeah, let's do it.
Wait, what would you like to know?
Well, just everything Adam and I have been going back and forth about. I mean, do you have any thoughts about America's foreign policy generally in the Middle East and how that relates to radical Islam and Islamic states?
Unfortunately, I don't have like much of an expertise in this area, but I'll give you my thoughts on the relationship between the rhetoric, the rhetoric of how we basically how we talk about Islam through the media.
Yeah, like let's say, how about an example like how Islam was discussed after the Paris attacks or after Charlie Hebdo. Maybe that will help. Is there anything you can think of in particular, like a particular event that happened, and then how Islam was portrayed after that, like, or maybe that famous Bill Maher quote, painting with a broad brush, and he got into a fight with Ben Affleck about it.
Right. But would that have to do with foreign policy, though? I'm not sure.
Oh, okay. I thought that's where you're going. But okay, go ahead. I
mean, unfortunately, I just don't have many. Like, you'd have to pick out something really specific. That's how literally illiterate I am on foreign policy.
Oh, okay, no big deal.
Well, I'll just throw out this general question, and we can all chime in, beginning with Ariel. So
yeah.
So Ariel, I guess to hone it in, why do you think we currently have, well, historically have had such an intimate alliance with Saudi Arabia, which probably is the most extreme embodiment of Islamic theocracy at the state level. And do you think that we should? Does that help us or hurt us?
Right. Okay. That's good. Yeah. I understand now. Okay. So the Wahhabism in Saudi Arabia isn't as extreme as different forms of Salafi Islam in other in minority groups, for instance. So a lot of people tend to think that Salafi is the Salafi, like for instance, a Salafi Muslim is a Muslim that believes that that there ought to be an Islamic State that imposes violence upon non-believers and even kills polytheists, for instance, like Hindus or something like that. But that's a caricature of the Salafi movement. There are different kinds of Salafis. Salafis are notoriously, for instance, very politically uninvolved Muslims. Believe it or not, it's only certain kinds of Salafis that want to build an Islamic State and drive out unbelievers and even conquer the world and turn everybody Muslim or kill all the people that won't convert to Islam. Now, Saudi Arabia is one of those countries that's heavily entrenched within classical Salafi Islam, but it isn't as faithful, in my opinion, to the source material as other sects of Salafi Muslims. And I think that's one of the reasons why the U.S. has been able to maintain a very close relationship with Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia isn't looking to establish, a caliphate, for example. They're very happy.
Interesting.
They're very happy to maintain, a Muslim country, but they don't want to have. They're not looking for, the next successor to Muhammad, for example.
Right. And just really quick, I think to go off that really quick, I think an aspect of why that is specifically is because from the beginning of the Wahhabi movement with al-Wahhab in the I think late 1700s, it began as basically a convenient religious political alliance between al-Wahhab and what we now know as the House of Saud, or the royal family. And I think that continues to be a kind of symbiotic and tempering relationship, because the royal family, they've always had a historical alliance with the Wahhabist movement and Wahhabist clerics, right? But they're self-interested, right? I mean, they just want to stay in power. They don't have these grandiose religious ideal, although they have tried to export Wahhabism to other areas of the Middle East and etc. I think, again, to go off what Ariel is saying, that's part of why they don't have as much of this global caliphate ambitions, because it's intricately linked with the House of Saud, the royal family, historically.
Right. There's two main kinds of Salafi Muslims. There are those political quietist Salafis that, for instance, they want there to be an Islamic takeover, but they rather leave it to God, as opposed to take up their arms and create an army and create a Islamic State as has been created. And then there's those other Salafi Muslims that think that the words in, for instance, Surah chapter 9, to slay the unbelievers, is to be acted upon by them without the assistance of another caliphate. So without there being an appointed successor to Muhammad, so you can either, wait for the next caliphate to arrive, or you can become the caliph.
Very good point. I never understood that distinction.
Right, and I think this is part of what's happening with ISIS right now, and I think partly explains their very troubling kind of global pull with thousands of foreigners pouring in to fight for ISIS, is because, and again, Ariel, correct me if I'm wrong, but because they do sort of represent the more Salafist tradition that says, in order to have a more official, divinely sanctioned jihad, you have to have an existing caliphate, right, and a caliph who in the Islamic State is currently represented by al-Baghdadi.
Right. It's really analogous to a lot of messianic movements within Judaism. So there have been messianic movements around, like throughout the centuries, where Jews have actually appointed for themselves a messianic leader, a Messiah, a king, to take over certain, either Christian governments or Muslim governments. And there have been other Jews that have been political quietists and have said to themselves in their communities that they're not going to appoint themselves or appoint others to be, messianic leaders, and they're going to be disinvolved from the political process. So you see that similar phenomenon going on in Islam.
Well, isn't that concept in Israel like alive and well in the same sense that they have imperialistic goals and Zionism basically?
Right. Yeah. There's some Jews.
Well, I was just going to say, I'd be very careful to distinguish Zionism from imperialistic goals.
Can you explain that?
I don't believe that Israel. I mean, Zionism is the idea, is the kind of religio-political idea, right? That the Jews have a kind of divinely appointed homeland and so forth. But again, from my understanding, there's no expansionist imperialism associated with that. I mean, even if you believe that they're engaged in, an immoral / illegal occupation of Palestine, I have no idea why someone would be under the assumption that Israel has expansionist goals. Although many radical Islamist groups like Hamas and Hezbollah, in their charters, they explicitly have, in many other statements, they have a kind of conspiratorial view of Israel and Jews in general. For example, I think in one of Hamas or Hezbollah's statements, they think that the Jews were basically behind almost every major world atrocity, in particular World War I, and that they're secretly and that they're secretly kind of trying to take over the world and etc. But Israel historically, I don't think has shown any behavior that would bear those conspiracies out.
Okay, so you brought up two things, very good points. I guess when I use the term expansionism or imperialism for Israel, I just meant the growth we've seen of Israel since it was created in the 40s.
Oh yes.
Not like a global domination type thing that we
Okay.
But still, it was important that you hashed that out. But I want to ask, what do you think about Israel being there? Do you think it as do either of you think that there's any kind of wrongness or moral incorrectness or anything wrong with what's happening there, or just the creation of Israel in the first place?
Why did you have to bring up this topic, man?
I know it's a tough one.
This is one touchy subject, touchier and touchier even in the West.
It seems to me to be almost a religious. I've heard and I saw a debate with Sam Harris and Reza Aslan, and they brought this up, but they kind of went over it really quickly. They didn't really talk about it much. I don't know why. I don't know if they already agreed to something that they just didn't reference, or if I'm missing something.
Yeah. Well,
it seems like a religious, it only makes sense for that area.
Well, let me say something really quick, Tincher,
Sure.
Because I think this question can get lost if you don't know this little, or we don't begin with this little bit of history really quick. So, Zionism originally, right before, I think we're at the Balfour Declaration, right? Where Britain basically sanctioned the Jews' immigration into the Palestinian territories in the 40s. Was it the 40s or 30s?
I
always forget when. I think it was the 30s.
I thought it was after World War II, or was it during that whole?
The Balfour Declaration, that was before. It was before. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Yeah, but anyway, so that started. So the early Zionist writers, Jewish writers in Europe, who argued for having some sort of Jewish state, they did not give explicitly religious, or at least not all of them gave explicitly religious reasons for this. From my understanding, the basic argument was that Jews, even at that time historically, were a disparate nation, right? A nation kind of cast to the four winds. They didn't have their own homeland, although they were their own ethnic and cultural group. They were just kind of spread across Europe and other areas. And European Jews thought that both because of that and because they had, again, even at that time historically experienced a lot of discrimination and et cetera in Europe, that they just had secular reasons why they should just leave Europe and go somewhere where they could have some sort of homeland. My understanding is not that this was explicitly religious. There were actually other areas, although I forgot what they were, that were suggested. It was more of a general idea. It didn't hinge on being like in the Holy Land and Palestinian territory. It just ended up being that when the British government finally decided to sanction that and endorse that, that was the area that they allowed them to do it.
I see.
But again, I'm not an expert on that, but that's my general understanding. It didn't begin as this explicitly religious, we have to go back to the homeland sort of thing. That it was at least in a large part just a secular idea.
Okay. I mean, Ariel, maybe are you familiar with the Torah and like the Hebrew faith and all that?
Yeah. Oh, but before I talk about that, I was curious to ask you a question. Do you believe that Israel has a right to exist?
My first thought is no, and I say that because I don't think you can just take land and expect things to be okay. I'm totally for, I like Ben was saying, there was a ton of persecution going on, and they didn't have a homeland. I'm not against Israel existing, but I certainly think that taking that land from somebody else, based on what it seems like to be a religious reason. I mean, it seems like at the end of the day it wasn't, but
Yeah.
But
well, I was just going to say really quick though, there were some illegal, obviously, and there have been throughout Israel's history. I definitely do not think Israel is blameless. There have been, illegal expansions and land acquisitions, but most of the major early land acquisitions in the Israeli territory, what was now the Israeli territory, were actually legally bought from absentee landowners. And you still might think that's an immoral thing to do, but
not at all.
Yeah, but
if it's a consensual, exchange of land, I support that.
Right. But you still might say, well, that still wasn't the ideal thing to do, right? Because these were just like absentee landowners that owned big amounts of land. It would have been more moral to say buy those and then allow local Palestinians to, build homes there and et cetera. Of course
I see.
They didn't. And you can go back and forth about that, but it is an important point that these were not just purely illegal land grabs. That again, many, if not most, of the earliest big land acquisitions were bought.
In that case, I wouldn't claim any moral incorrectness. If there's large areas of land that are bought, I have to support that.
Yeah.
But as you said, it's as time has gone on, it's grown and stuff. And from my point of see, I'm somebody who doesn't understand religion. I never had a religion taught to me. I never grew up in a religious family or anything like that. So for me, it's sometimes hard to believe that people would make such insane, or not insane, just extreme decisions based on the Quran or the Bible or something like that. So it seems that to me, when you see like, okay, you have an invading kind of nation in the eyes of Palestinians and Middle Eastern countries, I tend to attribute the violence to what seems to be an invasion of somebody's homeland.
Right, and I don't think that's an either or question, right? I definitely think that those things, those socioeconomic, political conditions, play an essential role. I just want to argue that they don't play the only role, and that religion plays a very substantial role in those reactions as well. But I know Ariel was trying to say some stuff about Israel and the Torah and etc. earlier, so I want to hear more from him.
Oh, I'm
Yeah.
sorry about that. Yeah. What were
Yeah.
you going to ask me? I'm sorry. I didn't mean to get you down that rabbit trail, but
No, it's totally cool, man. Um, I was gonna ask because I've heard that Israelis, according to the Torah, there was never supposed to be a homeland, or like something along the lines of um, the Jews were a stateless people, and that was in the Torah itself.
right. So I mean, if you look at the early book of Genesis, Abraham came from Mesopotamia, from the city of Ur, and him and his family had no land. It isn't until it isn't until the book of Exodus that they find the land of Palestine, and initially it wasn't even theirs. It was the home of the Canaanites, and they had to, according to the narratives at least, they killed the Canaanites in order to occupy the land. If that's what you're asking about, yeah.
Oh, in the Torah there is an establishment that this land in particular is belongs to the Jews, or is Israel.
Right. So, according to the narrative, the Canaanites, which were the original inhabitants of Palestine, had committed so many atrocities that God actually had to wait 400 years until he would be able to allow the Israelites into that specific land. So, he not only let the Israelites into the land because they were his chosen people, because of Abraham's faith, but also because of the atrocities and the idolatry of the original inhabitants of that land. So he kicked them out and brought in the Israelites. But then,
Well, let's not whitewash it. They didn't kick them out; they slaughtered them.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes. They slaughtered them full sail. That's what I should have said. Yeah. But then let's not forget, the Israelites actually did the very things that the Canaanites were accused of doing, or at least some of the things that the Canaanites were accused of doing. Many of the Israelites eventually they degraded themselves into idolatry. They started worshiping other gods, and God sent the Babylonians and the Assyrians to slaughter them. And many of them were exiled actually into Babylon. So they ended up doing the same things that they had been sent in for.
So let me ask this: what do you guys think are the problems today with just having this discussion? Like, I know the term Islamophobia comes around. I've even heard people defending the attackers of Charlie Hebdo. You know, Charlie Hebdo is a newspaper company that made a depiction of Muhammad, and terrorists came and shot them. I even heard people in the liberal side say, well, you shouldn't have drawn Muhammad. You are being disrespectful to the religion. You shouldn't be surprised that this type of thing happened. Obviously,
Yeah.
I would never agree with something like that, but what do you guys think about just how we're dealing with it as a nation, or how Obama in particular is dealing with it?
It's hard for me even to know where to begin when it comes to that leftist response to the Charlie Hebdo shootings and other instances. I don't have any patience for that type of view. And again, the same people that said these things, that were like, well, yeah, Charlie Hebdo was a horrible event, but there should be no buts, right, about free speech. And the same people that say those things would, defend like piss Christ, right, to the death. It's the most hypocritical, disingenuous thing that I've ever heard come out of an inheritor of the Western Enlightenment tradition's mouth. And again, I don't even know where to begin with it. I mean, the reason that we have free speech is to protect the most offensive types of free speech, right? If we only had a guarantee of free speech for what society at large thought was not offensive, well, that's the tyranny of the majority that, again, especially the American founders were explicitly trying to prevent by guaranteeing free speech and the rest of the Bill of Rights, right? And again, it's like a kind of cognitive disease on the left, and this has been pointed out, by people like Sam Harris and Majid Nawaz and et cetera, where it's all about groups and it's not about the individual, as Majid Nawaz has really emphasized, is that if someone belongs to what, in certain places, especially certain places in the West, belongs to a minority group, like Muslims as a group, right, are like a minority in the West, then they as a group need to be protected at all costs, right? And it's not like the individual, whether Muslim or not, like freedom to say what they want and do what they want within reason that's important. It's, well, free speech as long as it's not offending like historical minorities. Well, there are members of people that are minorities in certain places in the West, although they are super majorities, obviously, in other places like the Middle East and Indonesia and so forth, that are violent and bigoted and intolerant and have big issues in terms of how they view women and how they view free speech and all these sorts of things. And just because, again, it's a kind of ironic racism, right? Just because they have brown skin, we don't hold them to the same, Enlightenment ideals and standards that we would hold everyone else to.
Yeah, you're right. And it's that type of thinking. I think it has something to do with this new type of thinking in the liberal crowd. That is, you see the same type of logic with the new feminism movement, or like, you just well, whatever. We're not going to go down that path. What I want to say is, what would you? So how do you? Maybe I can best ask this question in these terms. How do you feel about another wave of interventionism in the Middle East because of ISIS? And Ariel, if you want to say something on that, also you can.
I probably won't.
All right, Ben, what do you think?
Well, no, I do want to hear from. I mean, if you have any thoughts, Ariel, because obviously that what we should do in terms of our foreign policy is obviously, deeply connected and with how we view these people's theology, or to what degree we think their theology influences their actions, and what they might do in the future. And so, if you have enough familiarity with ISIS's particular brand of Salafist theology, Ariel, I'd like to hear how you think that might relate to how we should respond or not respond.
I'm trying to think of a good way to answer that question. Did you want to start? Let me piggyback off of what you say, because that's usually a good tactic.
Well, actually, I want to hear from Adam first. Actually, I want to hear the non-interventionist argument.
The non-interventionist argument has gotten harder to make in recent times because of the rise of ISIS and the vacuum that's in Iraq, and just the amount of time that we've been there, being a force in the Middle East. It's going to be messy to pull out at this point.
Yeah. Well, and now Russia's, injecting its influence with Iran and Syria and et cetera now.
And you know what I say to that? I say, let them. My position is still to pull out, to not intervene in that situation, because I think of it like this. Because ultimately, I feel like we're doing harm in the Middle East because primarily of, intentional or not, the innocent lives that are lost because of our military intervention. I think that is creating a lot of terrorism that wouldn't have existed if we didn't make those mistakes. So, okay.
Although I do think we have to be realistic. It seems like I think in foreign policy in general, we're always in kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't sort of situation.
Yes.
Um, so, you know, on the one hand, it is true, right, to a degree. Obviously, many of the grievances of these groups is in response to our over intervention and support of dictators and et cetera. But even when and ISIS is the like paradigm example of this. When the Obama administration decided to, unilaterally withdraw all of our troops and our intelligence from Iraq, okay, well now we're not there anymore, right? So that should be a good thing in principle, right? 'Cause now the West isn't injecting its influence as much anymore. But Al Qaeda in Iraq, eventually evolving or offshooting into ISIS, just injected itself into that power vacuum and proceeded to slaughter Muslims and non-Muslims alike, and basically did the exact thing that the Bush administration kept warning about, which was that if we just allow these countries to destabilize and we refuse, right, to be a stabilizing force in the region, even though that can have the possibility of blowback, then it can be an even worse situation, because within that power vacuum and that vacuum of chaos, these extremist groups will actually inject themselves and set up the type, and we saw this in Afghanistan with the Taliban as well. They'll set up the type of governments that they initially wanted to but couldn't because there was too much authoritarian or Western influence, and then just use those, as ISIS is now doing, and as the Taliban did by facilitating Al Qaeda, as terrorist bases, right? To carry terrorist attacks around the world internationally, and that's the exact thing again the Bush administration warned against, and we're seeing that play out before our eyes right now.
Right, and that leads me to believe that maybe we can come to the conclusion that intervening is the most moral thing to do. Intervening and being there, and maybe even putting troops on the ground in a few years or whenever, is the morally correct thing to do. I still am not convinced that we're actually able to accomplish the goals that we set out, because the ultimate goal of invading Iraq, from what I understood, was to liberalize, to bring democracy, to allow them to be out from under Saddam Hussein and to kind of rule themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And if that's what we're going to try and do in Syria, I think we have pretty good evidence that it's not going to work if we do it the same exact way we did in Iraq.
Right. And again, I do think that's a serious concern. There is a serious concern about the general ideology that, again, we can just invade and set up a democracy in countries that don't have any real democratic experience. But on the other hand, again, I think we have to be careful to not draw in straight lines, right? Especially when it comes to Iraq. I mean, we did have free and open elections in Iraq, and it went pretty well at the beginning. But one of the main reasons that Iraq started to descend, into horrible civil war, and it was just dragged out indefinitely, it wasn't necessarily because, well, you could draw a straight line to just because we were trying to create a democracy somewhere. It had to do with early decisions by the Bush administration after, taking out Saddam's regime. Particular decisions they made, and the most important of which was the whole de-Baathification order, right, where there was an order that basically got rid of almost every government worker right associated with the Ba'athist party in Iraq, including the disbandment of the entire army, right? And many, if not most, of the insurgency in Iraq consisted of these former Ba'athist soldiers, right? Disenfranchised members of the army, and then other terrorist groups came in to try to take advantage of the situation. Actually, many Saudi nationals. There was one study that actually showed that, at least during a certain period in Iraq, during the chaos and civil war, that most of the suicide bombers in Iraq were Saudi nationals. And that's very interesting. They came from terrorist groups in Saudi Arabia. So I don't think it's as simple as, well, just democracy can't work in those areas. There were particular decisions and particular things that happened that could have gone differently that allowed Iraq to spiral. And again, what's tragic is that we really kind of almost nearly fixed that situation. Again, violence went down like 80-90% or whatever in 2007 after the surge. And we were making a lot of gains in Iraq, and violence had gone down drastically. We were serving as a diplomatic, presence with different tribes and religious groups in the government. But then I think for mainly political reasons, the Obama administration decided to just basically squander all that we had achieved since then, all that we had won back. And I think that's another main reason we're in the situation we are now.
And I think it was kind of a half-assed pullout. I never got the impression that we were done in the Middle East, but we were just pulling back of Iraq. Just not a little bit. I mean, there was a significant troop withdrawal, but the low the small amount of Americans that were in the Middle East after that was still a confusing thing to me. But so let me say this. So is your foreign policy represented by anybody running for president at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, in broad strokes, I would say Marco Rubio. Obviously, it's hard to know what particular things these people would do, but
right.
I guess the broad foreign policy position of a kind of realist neoconservatism, I tend towards, but I'm kind of in the middle of figuring out what I think about foreign policy right now, so I don't have any fast and ready opinions about that. But I know we go ahead.
That's unfortunate because my next question was Ben Cook president. What's the solution?
I want to hear Ariel's presidential solution.
Oh my goodness.
Yes, Ariel.
Everyone would die for my incompetence.
Oh, I thought you said Mein Kampf.
What, Ariel? How much do you know about ISIS's Salafism in particular? Do you know a lot about their theology?
I don't know much about their particular brand of Salafism, but I do know about Salafism. I mean, what question did you have? It depends on the question, I guess.
The question is, what do you think, in light of what we've done in Iraq and whatever mistakes that we made, what do you think is the best way to deal with ISIS?
Oh, jeez.
You don't have to, nothing too crazy, but just like, are you interventionist? Are you non-interventionist?
Oh, I see. Yeah.
Or also, again, to make it more, amenable to your background in this, related to what Adam just said, but also like, how do you think, again, that foreign policy response might be related to their Salafist ideology? Like, what might the relationship be there?
It's a good question. Militarily, I wouldn't be able to tell you, but I think one of the best ways to confront radical religious movements is to engage them on the level of ideas. I mean, these people don't respond well to ideas. They don't understand what it means to debate seriously, but I think when you deal with for instance, any majority Muslim country, the best way to at least try to get them to rethink their ideas is to kind of influence them through the media somehow, questioning Islam in some way. I'm not being specific enough because I don't really know how to do that, but I think.
Right. What I think you're saying is, it has to be an intellectual change.
Right.
But how do we do that?
Right. Right.
Well, Ben, what do
I
you
mean,
Well, because I mean that's kind of how I think. Also, I don't think it can be done with bombs and guns. It has to be done. Go ahead.
I wanted to say through social media, but obviously people that live in ISIS-controlled areas don't even have access to the internet. But if you're dealing with countries like, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I'm sorry. The thing is with ISIS too is we kind of did the same thing where they were partly not all of ISIS was, but a lot of the Free Syria Army, which we again funded and armed and trained, ended up becoming ISIS. It's just further evidence that it can't be done through militaristic means. But now that we have these armed, unreachable individuals, is there still chance for an ideological change, an educational change?
Well, I definitely think that this is a major problem because, like Ariel was just pointing out, in ISIS-held territories, there's limited to no access to at least open technology, the internet, and so forth. I think this is generally a problem, right? With whether in more terroristic states that held territory like ISIS or the Taliban when it ruled in Afghanistan, where they banned television and almost all modern technology. You couldn't drive cars and so forth. But also in major states like Iran and Saudi Arabia, right, that limit the amount of information that people can attain. And if you're writing or saying the wrong things, then you're punished. So there's a lot of pressure not to explore certain things, politically and socially. So that is a very big problem. And I definitely think, so I guess what I'm trying to say is that if people think that, well, the main problem is that just people who believe these more radical, Islamist ideas, they can't be convinced. Well, some can't, but I think many of them could be convinced otherwise, and they're on the fence. They live in a, confusing world where they feel like they're having to choose between just like total Westernization or just like radical Wahhabism or the type of radical Shiism of Iran and so forth. But if they had more access to information, like Ariel is emphasizing, then I do think, like most people, there would at least be a substantial number of people that would change their minds. And I think the reason to think that is just because that's what's happened as the West has opened up with information and having freedom of speech and et cetera, that there have been a wider and wider, sphere of views that people have, more and more religious heretics and atheists and agnostics and et cetera. Not that those are necessarily the better or the good views, but people can and will change their minds and become more tolerant of other people as you expand access to information and as people know like what scholarship says about what they believe and et cetera.
So after having said that, what would you condone the most, or what would you praise the most about our foreign policy so far? Or I guess I just asked you two questions. Let me just say, what do you think are the most redeeming qualities of what we've been doing in the Middle East since 2001, or since the original shock and awe? Does that make sense?
Yeah. I don't know. There have been a hell of a lot of mistakes. But again, by both administrations.
But you still have I don't want to use the word faith, but you still believe that if we were to take another stab at it, we would do better this time?
I think it's possible, right? But it's just so difficult to. I think it is possible and more feasible than we realize if we had the right sort of leadership to actually do something like we did in Iraq and have it be a lot more successful, right? But it's just, how can you trust these guys that we elect into government? From either party and the people that they appoint to be their diplomats and to run these sort of things and et cetera. Like in Iraq, there were like generals on the ground that were much more familiar with Iraqi society and the region, et cetera, that were adamantly and vocally opposing the de-Baathification order.
Mm.
But I forgot his name, but the diplomat that we sent there to oversee that, he was just like, whatever, and then kind of idealistically just get rid of the Ba'athist Party, and that was a horrible decision, and this picking the wrong person, just like one wrong person in an administration can make a disaster out of these projects. But I do think it's at least possible that you could have a project like that. And I think in the long run, the people in the Middle East, the ethnic group in the Middle East that we'd have the most success trying something like that with, or really helping them do that, are the Kurds. but there are obviously many reasons in the short term why we can't just be like, all right, there's a Kurdish state and we're going to protect you with the military. But I think that should be like a long-term policy goal of ours, because the Kurds are one of the most moderate and pluralistic and secular groups in the Middle East, and sadly they don't have their own state to act as both a bulwark for themselves, but also to serve our strategic interests in the region.
Yes, it's a mess, all right. But so I know you're saying that you're still on the fence about how you feel about foreign policy and stuff. So I don't want to push you in somewhere where you haven't fully thought it out. But so are you a interventionist or a non-interventionist, or is there some way we could meet halfway there?
Well, I think almost everyone is kind of, in an uninteresting sense, a prudential interventionist, right? I think even you would say that we should intervene when it makes sense, but obviously the messy, complicated business is, when does it make sense, right? I mean,
yeah, you're right, and that actually reminds me. Have you ever seen the Joe Rogan podcast?
Once or twice. I saw a little bit of the one he did with Sam Harris.
That's a great one. There's one, he has this guy named Jocko Willink on it, and he was in the military for like 20 years. He was a Navy SEAL, like top dog. It's such a cool podcast because it's 3 hours long, and Joe Rogan's just asking him everything he knows about what happened over there.
Oh, that's cool.
And Joe Rogan said, it changed my views also. It made me less, well, whatever. Joe Rogan asked him, "Oh, okay, so if there's Jocko Willink president, what would be the situation with ISIS?" And he said if he was president, they would be gone in 72 hours. And he was basically making the point that there's so much bureaucracy in the war that it prevents the SEALs from actually doing their job. And the way he kind of made it seem like it would be easy to do his job, which is to kill terrorists or to eradicate terrorism, if he didn't have the limitations put on him by government.
Sure.
So
yeah.
So that kind of, I'm kind of arguing against myself in the sense that maybe it wouldn't be so hard. Maybe even like to what you were saying, how it just takes one person in the administration to mess it up. I mean, maybe it's even easier, or even if there is that one person, it wouldn't be enough to mess up the whole thing if you just gave the SEALs the ability to do what they want. But then you get then you have, we can't give them all the freedom they want, because I guess you don't know what's going to be the collateral damage of what they think the right solution is.
Sure. Yeah. So I guess from my view, there are three main things that often these are the three same things that prevent us from doing what we need to do or being as successful, particularly in the war on terror. And I'm including ISIS in that. One of them is what you're just mentioning, what that SEAL was talking about, and I've heard that from other like SEALs and Army Rangers and et cetera, that they do feel like there are too many constraints and bureaucracy and et cetera for them just doing their job. So I think there's a bureaucratic issue. The second issue I would say is that, and this is another issue that relates to trying to stay in a place long enough to establish a feasible democracy, is there's a public will issue, right? That Americans grow tired of war very quickly. And if you don't have that public support, while you're president, or, when you're considering who is going to get elected, then a lot of the stuff just isn't sustainable. A lot of the things that we could do in our war on terror just aren't sustainable because we don't have the public will to finish them through, for very understandable reasons. I forgot what the last thing was, but there are two for
they're very good. Let me ask you. Well, so maybe this will trigger that third thing. What exactly?
Don't trigger me, bro. You said trigger. I'm meta triggered.
don't trigger me, bro. That's a shirt. That's a shirt waiting to happen. I was gonna say is okay. So, what do you think the benefits have been to America? Like, is there any benefit that we have gained from all of this? Would you argue that terrorism has been reduced because of the war? Like, is that the main benefit of our intervention so far?
You know, again, like I said with the whole damned if you do, damned if you don't thing, I geopolitics and foreign policy are always extremely messy and extremely difficult to get like good empirical data about. Like usually we only kind of know like whether something was overall good or bad in hindsight, and there's almost no way that we can like predict with any success like what all the long-term repercussions of any of our actions are. So on the one hand, I do think that certain of our actions, certain of our mistakes have probably, again, not been the sole cause of, but have had an ampliative effect on terrorist activity internationally. But on the other hand, it's not like we haven't had any success, right? I mean, there have been both in the United States and in Europe there because of, great, work by our intelligence officials. There have been countless significant terrorist plots that have been foiled by, again, especially by the CIA and MI6 and so forth. So I mean, and that's important. We can't know what all the long-term repercussions are going to be, but if we do know, that terrorists are currently plotting a very specific thing, that we need to have at least the intelligence resources to know about those things and to stop them. And again, the whole question of the trade-off between, well, we don't want, a place we have a lot of involvement in to become, a kind of blowback area for terrorism, but on the other hand, we also don't want to have, no involvement and just let those groups run rampant and maybe, end up having something like the Iranian Revolution or the Taliban, where they establish a state that's a terrorist state, that's no better, right? It's no better than like the dictators and usually worse than the often authoritarian regimes that they replaced. And I think if we have to make a choice, right, between radical Islamist theocracies and the typical authoritarian or dictatorial regime that we've seen historically, I think usually dictators are the lesser of two evils, right? Usually. I mean, I think Saddam's regime was one of the most horrendous extreme totalitarian examples, right, of a more secular dictatorship. But a lot of early neoconservative thinkers pointed this out, but they said it about communism, but I think it actually can apply to theocracy as well, where they basically said that, during the Cold War, it was better to just in the short term have an alliance with dictators in the region, because at least dictatorships in the long term, because they're just run by kind of self-interested autocrats, right, that we can have more control over, right, because they're like self-interested. They don't have like a broad ideology usually, right? And I think that was one of the problems with Saddam's regime, is that he did have a radical, like Ba'athist, pan-Arabic totalitarian ideology, but bracket that. So anyway, the general idea is that totalitarianisms are worse and more dangerous and more destructive, both for us and for their own people, right, in the long run, than monarchies, dictatorships are, right? And it's because ideologies like communism and like radical Islamic, theocratic ideologies, is that they are intrinsically totalitarian in the sense that they not only rule with an iron fist politically, but they invade every aspect of a person's life, every aspect of their economic life, every aspect of their social and moral life. And most dictatorships, most monarchies, they don't do that. And it's because of that we can have more control over them. Again, not that they don't engage in brutal crackdowns and have human rights violations and etc. But as a type of regime, monarchies are the lesser of two evils relative to totalitarian regimes like communism and theocracies.
Okay, I was getting a little confused about the distinction between totalitarianism and dictatorship, but I think you just answered it in that last part, which a totalitarian government is more of an ideological driven government like communism or Islam or like the caliphate type concept.
Right, where they have state-enforced prescription. Yeah. Totalitarians, like by definition, they have state-enforced prescriptions that have to do with almost every aspect of life. That's why they're called totalitarian, right? The totality of one's economic, social, and personal life. So, it's not intrinsic to dictatorships that they do that. Sometimes they do. So obviously, sometimes dictatorships decay into totalitarianism, like the Saddam regime, right? But they don't intrinsically do that. But states that are founded on a totalitarian ideology, like communist states and theocratic states like Saudi Arabia and Iran and the Taliban was, if you want to call it a state, pseudo-state. We didn't recognize it as a state. But they're intrinsically totalitarian from the get-go.
Right. So where would you, just a little side note, where would you put Nazi Germany in those two categories? Where would you put them?
They're kind of in between. I mean, Nazi Germany, I think, was kind of, they were like pseudo-totalitarian dictatorships, much like Saddam's Ba'athist regime was. Obviously, it's not as if there's like a dichotomy, right, where you have to either be a totalitarian or a I mean, most totalitarian regimes are run by a dictator, right? But I'm just talking about, like, theoretically, there's the concept of a dictatorship and there's the concept of a totalitarian state. And you usually, states fall in kind of a spectrum if they're authoritarian, right? They're either kind of purely dictatorial, but they're not totalitarian. They don't try to control every aspect of someone's economic and personal life.
Right.
Or they're totally totalitarian, like Soviet Russia was, like Maoist, China was, and like states like Iran and Saudi Arabia are largely, not completely, but they're totalitarian in enough of a sense where people's moral and personal and economic lives are not totally free and are kind of monitored.
So there's no. I've heard people say that because there's not a lot of Muslim leaders that are speaking out against ISIS, that there's some kind of agreement or some kind of similarity between maybe other Muslim countries that they in some way kind of support what ISIS is doing. I don't want to put words in your mouth. What do you think of that argument?
I don't know. I don't know what these different states' intentions are. I will say this. I don't think that most states support what ISIS is doing, if for no other in the region. If for no other reason but that it just obviously is not going to serve their self-interest. But on the other hand, again, I keep going back right to Saudi Arabia and Iran. They are basically the two biggest state sponsors of terrorism in the world. So they don't like ISIS because it's not their cup of terrorism. But they like, Iran likes Hezbollah and Hamas and Saudi Arabia, like the Taliban and the Jamaat in Pakistan and so forth. So, but Ariel, what are you thinking?
Yeah, Ariel.
I mean, one big reason why Iran wouldn't like ISIS is because it's incredibly Sunni.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's one reason. Saudi Arabia doesn't like ISIS because they think that their quote-unquote caliph is an illegitimate claimant. And there's also the issue of the fact that there's how do I say this? A lot of the traditions that are used in ISIS are not considered legitimate in the Salafi movement. in Saudi Arabia, or the Wahhabi movement, I should say, in Saudi Arabia. So
So
I'm trying to. So do you guys remember there was this declaration of over 100 Islamic scholars that they signed disapproving of ISIS?
Yeah.
Do you guys remember that? Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
I
So,
have seen that, but somebody had pointed out that it's still not the leaders themselves that are calling out ISIS. But I think you've answered that sufficiently, though.
Yeah. Anyway, go ahead, Ariel. What were you saying?
oh yeah. So I was just saying that the way well, I should say the structure of the caliphate is a lot different from what um, a lot of other Muslims think the caliphate should be like.
Okay, so let me ask you this: if you think there's any validity to the argument that if we pull out of the Middle East, that um, there's enough disagreement among the other nations like Iran and Saudi Arabia that ISIS will never actually become the caliphate, because kind of like the enemy of our enemy is our friend, in the sense that Iran and Saudi Arabia are going to kind of handle it because of their disagreements they have.
Can you repeat the question? I'm sorry.
Do you think Saudi Arabia and Iran would actually be a force to suppress ISIS if we weren't there because of those religious disagreements?
It's tough to say because I don't think Saudi Arabia is doing anything substantive at the moment. They don't seem to care enough, even with the presence of U.S. troops.
Yeah, I wonder why that is. I wonder why, like you said, there are those religious disagreements between those two parties. So I wonder why Saudi Arabia isn't more willing to like attack ISIS or deal with ISIS, or at least be more vocal about it.
I mean, because I know that Saudi Arabia and Iran have significant theological disagreements.
Right.
But
So I guess what I'm just saying is, like, how can ISIS become the caliphate, which is I think what everybody's afraid of, if you have such powerful nations that are already there, like Iran and Saudi Arabia. Does that make sense?
Adam, is basically your point, or your question or whatever, is that there's kind of too much like religious conflict and disagreement between the major states in the region for us to expect them to have a feasible coalition against ISIS?
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, I think that's a legitimate query.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was going to bring up something from the question you asked me last time, the last question you asked me. But go ahead. You can finish this, and just wanted to go back and draw a theological implication of the caliphate of ISIS.
Oh, do it. Go for it.
Oh, no, I just wanted to, because you had asked me what some of the differences were between Saudi Arabia and ISIS in terms of their theology. So one of the significant disagreements that ISIS and Saudi Arabia have in terms of their theology is that Saudi Arabia has a specific view on their relationship with Christians and Jews. So if you look at the Quran, in several chapters, actually, the Quran actually says very positive things about Christians and very positive things about the monotheism of the Jews. And even in one of the most violent chapters of the Quran, Surah chapter 9, it says that the Christians and Jews, in distinction from the polytheists, were not to be killed. They were simply to be humiliated by paying a tax that sets them apart from polytheists, because in Islamic theology, Christians and Jews are actually called people of the book. So they were marked out for different treatment because they were recipients of God's revelation in the form of the Torah and the gospel. Now, because of that, Christians and Jews shouldn't be killed. Now, there's questions about, how you should treat them, but you definitely shouldn't kill them. And Saudi Arabia, as terrible as Saudi Arabia might be, one thing you can say is that they don't, execute Christians and Jews. Now, if you look at groups like Al Qaeda and ISIS and certain other groups in the Middle East that are, Islamist groups, paradigmatic Islamist groups that are really hardcore, Salafi, that aren't, your typical Salafi from Saudi Arabia. There's another interpretation of how you treat Christians and Jews. So, in Islamic tradition, if you apostatize from Islam, you should be killed. And that's a very popular tradition. That's a very authentic tradition found in the Hadith, found in the other early sources, found in the early Caliphate. If you're a Muslim and you apostatize from Islam, you should be killed. I think even a lot of Saudi Arabian sheikhs, Saudi Arabian Islamic scholars would agree with that.
Well, yeah, and just really quick, we see those types of honor killings even among, obviously a minority, but conservative Muslim families even in the West.
Right. And
wow.
Here's a twist. Here's the ISIS twist, and the here's the Al Qaeda twist.
Sounds like a soda commercial.
Exactly. So there's also another facet of Islamic theology. There's this teaching that at the beginning of creation, there's a story. It's in the Hadith where God creates Adam, and what he does is he actually rubs Adam's back, and then all of a sudden, after he rubs Adam's back, all of Adam's descendants, so all of Adam's children, come out of his body. Think of that image, right? So all of
a very disgusting zit.
Yeah. All of Adam's descendants, including us, came out of his body, and they all pledged allegiance to Allah as the one and only creator and the only deity that is to be worshipped. So
wow.
Prior to our own mortal existence, we had this pre-mortal pledge or pre-mortal covenant with God where we are to worship God as the only creator. And that's why all Muslims actually believe that everybody who has ever lived was born a Muslim. So
wow.
Everybody was born a Muslim. And it isn't until later in life that you begin to pick up impure or corrupted beliefs about polytheism or secularism or whatever. Now, in the minds of certain Muslim extremists, even becoming a Christian or becoming a Jew is a form of apostasy or a form of shirk. Shirk is the Arabic word for idolatry. So even in the minds of some Muslim extremists and in their traditions, want to become even a Muslim or a Jew, even if you never converted to Islam, that's a form of apostasy. And because you apostatize by becoming a Christian or being born into Christianity and being raised a Christian, you deserve to be killed.
Wow. Well, let me just say this, gentlemen. We've been at this for 2 hours. How we feeling?
Feeling good, baby.
Yeah, I think we can probably shut it down at this point. Even though I feel like we made some good progress. I definitely learned a lot.
As have I.
We should do this again and some other topics or related topics. It's fun.
Yeah. I mean, like I said, this is the first episode of my new podcast, so I'm definitely going to be doing stuff, and I'd love to have both of you guys on in the future.
Well, congratulations, Adam.
Yeah, getting out there in the technology world, trying to get my voice heard.
You got some killer content up on that YouTube, bro.
Thank you, man. Thank you. I'm working on it. Right now, I'm doing a 3-day juice cleanse, and hopefully by the end of it, after being healthier and stuff, I'll have more energy to really do a lot of work on my channel.
True that.
That's the hope. Hopefully. But yeah, thanks guys. Thank you very much.
Thank you, bro.
Thank you.
Yeah, we're definitely gonna have this conversation again, and because that's just the nature of this issue. But is there anything you guys would like to say at the close of this, or any particular point that you would want to the people listening to really understand about this conversation, or the most important aspect of this conversation?
I think for my part, I would just say the most important aspect is that we're having this conversation, and there's such a breakdown of communication and ability to have these sorts of respectable conversations among people if you deeply disagree, just between, leftists and conservatives, or libertarians and leftists and conservatives, or whatever. I think we just need to, as people are always saying, we need to raise the level of discourse, beyond so much of the noise that we hear in mainstream media and, politicians and et cetera. And we just need to be able to calmly and without offense just address the most, and I think this is the most important issue politically, of our generation. I mean, this is the fundamental political or geopolitical question of our time. And if we can't have, serious and open conversations about this, I have little hope that we'll make progress at any level, and with what I view as the greatest threat facing our time,
Well said, brother. Well said, my man. Ariel, you got anything? That you don't have to. I'm just curious.
What do you have to say? I want to hear from you.
Oh, jeez. Well, yeah, I mean, I really agree with what Ben just said. It's about that when we get to the point where we can have discussions about things that are arguably the most important things facing our nation. If we can't have that discussion, then we're up shit's creek. No matter what decision we make, it's not going to be the right decision because we don't have an intellectual understanding about what we're actually doing and what our goals are. And for some reason, from the far left, we've been getting this anti-free speech mentality, which is, it seems to me to be the single most un-American thing possible. But on the topic of our intervention and stuff, I think people who are weighing in on this topic need to have an understanding of what's going on. And I've been a victim of this myself, or I've done this to myself, which is just making statements that aren't fully researched and without having all viewpoints considered. So
Ditto.
It's tough, man. There's so much emotion involved in these kind of discussions, so it clouds the truth sometimes.
I've fallen prey to that as well. I mean, it happens to everybody. It happens to the best of us, so don't even worry about it. I've been embarrassed so many times by things I've said that I've had to hit myself constantly.
Well, what usually happens with Ariel is that he'll say something like awesome and insightful, and then he'll immediately be like, "Oh, that's just my opinion. That's probably stupid." I'm like, "What the hell, dude?"
That should be published, bro.
Right.
Well, yeah, okay. Thank you very much, guys, and hopefully see you again in the future.
Yeah, thanks for having us. Talk to you soon.
See ya. Thanks, bro.